So I'm going to transition to the next portion, which is more related to broader food systems theory and rebuilding the food shed.
Mm-hmm.
So we're now transitioning.
Okay, transition movement.
Yeah, that was the transition move. Or one of these, click. In your book, Rebuilding the Food Shed, just a personal question, is that a play off the word watershed?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it is a play, but it's a play that goes back to the early 1900s. And it actually goes back to New York City. And I believe his name was Walter Hedden, who was the head of basically the Port Authority for New York City at the time. And the notion of watershed had really sort of come to the fore, had risen up in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so he was thinking about really overseeing these ports, thinking about watersheds, and then started to think about the economic flow of goods coming in and coming out. And so it was him back in, I think it was 1909, I may be wrong on the date, that came up with this notion of the word food shed, which sort of disappeared until the 1970s, 1980s. There was a permaculture article that came out that started to use, again, this notion of food shed and use it in the sense more of, the food shed being both the flow of goods to a certain degree related to our food supply, but also about the community fabric that's part and parcel of that. So it's a pretty neat word as you look into history, and that's part of what I do in the book, is recount some of the history of how it came about. And I still think there are new ways that we're using it now that are kind of interesting.
When you think of a multifaceted food system, what images come to mind?
Certainly more of a connection, more of a relationship between the farmer and the consumer when possible. Starting with the soil, ending with the soil, keeping soil in mind throughout the entire process. I think that's one of the new realizations we're having, is just, healthy soil builds healthy animals, healthy plants, healthy people, healthy ecosystems. So that's one of the beauties of the conversation that's beginning to go on right now. But also about these interlocking parts of the food system. And I think that was one of the really fascinating things in writing this book, was thinking about the fact that, in a lot of ways, the image that doesn't come to mind immediately when we think about food sheds and food systems is the middle. The middle part of the food system is not sexy. It's a lot of stainless steel and diesel fumes and trucks, and, there are all sorts of things there, all these moving parts, the processing, the storage, the distribution. And in many ways, that's where the heartbeat is. And so, we've got these romantic notions of what a food system looks like, but I think we need to think about the non-sexy middle sometimes.
Moving toward a vision for the future, I'm wondering just if you have more to say on a well-functioning food system and how you would say they could be adopted on a mass scale in the 21st century.
Maybe as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking of two images. One is of nested systems, so where you've got the hyper-local and the local, and then the state and the regional and the national and the international, and we tackle the ones closest at hand first in order to try to put them together in a way that makes sense, and maybe that has these reverberations throughout those concentric circles. Maybe that increases the velocity of the ripple, although I know that goes against physics, but at the same time, there's another way of thinking about it, I think, is when we do have these local food systems or regional food systems, and then we start to think about how those might themselves interlock, and so how do we build this resilient system through these interlocking local or regional food systems. And I think we have to recognize that it's more complex than just local, and it's more complex than just organic. It really is very often about how we bring those maybe not disparate elements, but sometimes distant elements together. And that's the fun part of it. And that's why food systems has been recognized as an academic discipline now, because we're realizing that this is an intellectual enterprise as well as one built on sweat equity. But it's one where we've got to think hard, and probably, I don't know, when I first came to Green Mountain College in Vermont at the very beginning, 21 years ago, I actually had folks who used the word anti-intellectual when they referred to agriculture within the academy. And certainly I don't embrace that. I think now we recognize it's actually a lot harder than anyone thought. And it's pretty cool now that that's more and more part of mainstream academia.
Slight transition here to the idea of food security at being really at the heart of, in my opinion, of any grassroots movement. I'm wondering if you could discuss the idea of the farm or food center as being really the heart of participatory democracy.
The phrase that I came up with and have been using in talks since is really Foodshed as new democracy. And I think that's being realized. You see that kind of spinning out in a lot of the media that probably you and I read very often. But, it is this notion that, yes, food is a commodity, but also food is an inalienable right, or at least it should be. In the United States, it's ironically not recognized that it is an inalienable right. The right not only to food, but to good, clean, fair food that's culturally appropriate. And that's a tall order, but why can't we get there? I mean, if we can talk about amorphous things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, why in the world can we not talk about clean food and clean water actually being part of what is just part of being a human? That's a basic expectation. And it's really tragic that we're not at that point yet.
Is there a new definition of community that's needed as it pertains to designing and maintaining, say, the rebuilding of local food systems? Where does the initial investment of land and labor come from?
I think kind of with a philosophy background, I'm always inclined to be a little bit of a skeptic whenever there's a new word or new phrase that pops out. And that's just part of the job of being a good academic, I suppose. And so when I first heard the word resilient, scratching my head a little bit, and then more recently, hearing the word regenerative being utilized more and more. And so I'm at the point right now where I've pretty heartily embraced the notion, well, certainly of resilient, but then also of regenerative. So when I think of communities, I'm thinking more and more now about regenerative communities. And in part that's based off of the movement from in my own thinking, from going from rebuilding the food shed to a precautionary tale, where rebuilding a food shed, we're really thinking hard about local and organic systems, but then to see a precautionary tale and see what this one community was able to do in advancing this notion forward of having a food shed that was truly regenerative. That's really powerful. And now there's this question, can we unite these communities that are aiming for that? And they're aiming for it from all over the world. And Vandana Shiva is doing an amazing job in pulling together communities in the Himalayas in particular right now, but with a poison-free communities initiative. And so I think, it's exciting. It's more hopeful than it's ever been in my lifetime, I think.
This is the portion where I'd like to attempt to bridge the divide between agriculture and climate change. Definitely referencing Vandana Shiva, I'm wondering just how, I'll say, food democracy complements earth democracy.
Yeah, I'd say it's one and the same, ultimately. The sustenance, is so integrally linked to how we engage with the world, on a daily basis, that, food democracy and earth democracy really are the same thing. Since, we are talking about one big, massive ecological unit, so, the ramifications of our food choices, are ultimately planetary choices, planetary impacts. And I think Vandana would certainly say that, and she'd say it more eloquently than I, because boy, she just has a magic in the way that she's able to put this forward.
One thing I worry about is, again, a lack of understanding of what the daily life of a farmer, conventional or organic, is for a person who's going to the grocery store or even to a farmer's market, not living the same lived experience, not having the same labor demands, if you will. But one thing that I've been learning more about is that farmers, in many instances, are locked into contracts that, again, the consumer may not be aware of, but that there seems to be, as environmental advocates, there's a temptation to, I'll say, demonize farmers.
Yeah, it's something that I talk about in my classes a lot. There's a course I've been teaching for probably 15 years called Sustainable Farming Systems at Green Mountain College, and be taking part of that to Sterling College. Where I ask this in the syllabus, that the students, as we visit one farm after another, and I try to mix up those farms in terms of type and scale and management approach, I ask them to be analytical instead of judgmental. And I think there's a difference there. So there's this manner in which you can approach a farm and come at it from an analytical perspective, where you're really trying to come at it, almost objectively. I mean, it's never 100%, but where you're really asking the questions, trying to assess how it's functioning in terms of sustainability, animal welfare, thinking about community, thinking about transition to next generations, thinking about economic sustainability. So if we can be more analytical and less judgmental, then I think we'd be much better off. No one likes being at the other end of a label. I think we do that too readily. I myself, I find myself sometimes feeling like I have to use the word industrialized agriculture or conventional and agriculture, or, associating that with farmers. I don't think that that's necessarily very fair in a lot of cases. I, try to not use that language when I'm able to, because that's really important. So, labels are problematic. Things get polarized really easily. And then finally, I think we also have these, in the kind of progressive world, these pejorative associations with scale, and large scale and small scale. And ultimately, if we really look hard, it's not necessarily about scale as much as it is about management. And we don't quite talk about it in that reference point very often. And I think we'd be better off.
So if everyone can't become a farmer, or if that's not their ideal role, if you will, what are the other roles that folks can assume just to, again, assist in crafting these new systems? And again, instead of blaming farmers, is there a way that we can recognize, I'll say, our capacity to heal as stewards of plants, animals, and the planet as a whole?
I think whenever we can find ways to build those relationships back, I mean, farmers markets being such a powerful piece of it, which it's not just about community, it's about the rhythms of our lives, and shifting the rhythms of our lives to adapt to, how and where we buy food, and that can really add a lot of value to one's life. Well, will it take you a little bit longer? Sure, sometimes it might. On the other hand, there's that level of social engagement, which is so high and so important. Because if you want to look for a place in which democracy was born, and actually the Greeks had this notion of the agora. The agora was the marketplace, but it was also in many ways the birthplace of democracy. And so I think there's the marketplace of ideas that I think is very important. So farmers market, maybe that's the truest sense or location really of Foodshed as new democracy.
So where can folks learn more about your work, and especially about your books?
Mm-hmm. So folks can check out the Chelsea Green, which is the publisher that I've been with now for about 15 years. And wonderful mission-driven organization, employee-owned, first really green publisher in the country. So check them out for all of the books there, but can find my books there. And then also can find more of the work that I've been doing with Sterling, Sterling College will have the School for the New American Farmstead. So I would encourage people to look at what's happening there, where we really are bringing in some of the best farmers in the country and artisans, who are doing all sorts of amazing things in the food industry, and bringing them in for courses. And then also if people are interested in a precautionary tale, that story, they can check out topplinggoliath.org. which is a joint project with the Lexicon of Sustainability, and they can see the website, which tells more of that story.
Topplinggoliath.org. Got it. So I'm wondering if you could sum it up. What would be your message to younger people, say adolescents or folks entering high school?
Yeah, I think there is, for a lot of the younger generation, they're reaching a certain point at which they're finding an ennui or a boredom or a dissatisfaction, with various things. And instead of getting too angsty about it, I think get get out to the garden, get out to the community garden, find ways to, jump on the bike and get into the natural landscape, and dare yourself, perhaps, to meet someone at the farmer's market or meet a farmer, or, I think there are all these ways to engage, which can be a little threatening because, there is this, diminishing agricultural literacy really in so many ways. And so I think re-engaging with the landscape and the community is the way to try to rebuild that agricultural literacy, lest it be gone far too fast. And as we move from a predominantly rural country now to a more urban country, then I think it's really incumbent upon us to explore the vestiges of that, the best that the rural world has to offer. And usually that is food.
Philip Ackerman-Leist, thank you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Garrett. It's been a pleasure.
Here's to positive change coming swiftly in the future.
Let's make it happen.
Yeah.